Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
You probably had COVID sometime this summer, and if you didn't, you know a bunch of people who did. Indications are that the virus is circulating now at levels not seen since early 2021. Now, we don't know that for sure because we don't track it so well these days. Some people don't bother to test if it feels like a cold. Some people can't get tests. Some people do test and don't care much about the result. And some people, as has always been the case, get it and never know they had it. But we've learned a lot since 2020, and one thing we do know is even if the virus is milder now, every time you get COVID, no matter who you are, how young or old or healthy or not, you are rolling the dice. The science behind what's known as long COVID is fascinating, and it's critical to the thousands and thousands of people who suffer from it. There is so much we now understand about this phenomenon that we didn't 4 years ago, but there is still so much left to discover, including, notably, a cure, or at least more effective treatments. Today, we'll take a look inside the world of a researcher who is on the cutting edge of the attempt to figure out just what exactly long COVID is, who gets it, and why, and what to do if, maybe, the next time you get COVID, because there's probably going to be a next time, it just doesn't go away. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Dr. Ziyad Al-Aly is a clinical epidemiologist at Washington University in St. Louis. He is the Chief of Research and Development at the VA St. Louis Healthcare System. Hello, Dr. Al-Aly.
Well, hello. Delighted to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a while since we covered COVID of any sort on this show. I think a lot of people would probably hope we were done with it. But it has been, honestly, quite the summer for a resurgence of this virus, no?
Well, that's exactly right. So it's very, very clear that the virus is not seasonal. I mean, we'd like it to be seasonal. We'd like it to be like the flu, but it's absolutely not. The data tells a different story. You know, there is a surge now ongoing in much of the world, in the US and Canada and in Europe and actually several other countries, you know, primarily by the subvariant called KP.3. We see wastewater data showing an uptick in the virus levels. We see emergency room visits increasing or showing an uptick now in the US and also in several other countries. We see also hospitalizations for COVID rising in the middle of the summer. And that's really, unsettling. So we'd like to sort of think that we're done with COVID and the pandemic is behind us. But the fact is that COVID is still around, is actually still mutating, spawning new variants and subvariants, and still causing severe illness in some individuals, leading to hospitalization and even death.
And we wanted to speak to you because of your work on long COVID, which I think now that precaution levels for the virus are basically incredibly low anywhere around the world, most people are getting this virus or know many people who have. So the concern is, how often will it linger? So maybe before we get into all that and some of the work that you're doing and what we're learning about it, can you just explain what long COVID is after 4 years? Do we have a technical definition for it? How do we describe it?
Sure. So we have a lot of definitions, including one by the WHO and then one recently published by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in the US. So we have developed actually a pretty robust understanding of what long COVID is. Simply what long COVID is really the constellation of symptoms and health effects, the long-term health effects that are caused by SARS-CoV-2 infection. So what does that really mean? That really means that people may get a SARS-CoV-2 infection, COVID-19, may get shortness of breath or fatigue. And in some individuals, those things, if they linger for more than 3 months, that becomes long COVID. That becomes sort of the fatigue that's associated with long COVID. It becomes, some individuals may have actually brain fog or may have respiratory problems, like shortness of breath that lingers for a long time after the initial infection. In some cases, people are actually, either asymptomatic or very mildly symptomatic when they get COVID-19, but then weeks later, they start developing fatigue or brain fog and other manifestations. So all of those health effects, collectively, all of those health effects are referred to as long COVID. So it's an umbrella term for all the long-term ill effects, if you will, that are caused by SARS-CoV-2 infection caused by COVID-19.
And that's when they linger for longer than 3 months. And I just want to make sure we understand this, because honestly, to me, 3 months, less than 3 months seems like an awfully long time for symptoms to stick around as well. Is that typical for COVID, where symptoms can stick around for 8-10 weeks, but not yet cross that 3-month line?
So the variations and definitions, actually, so you're absolutely right on point. You have your finger on the pulse. The earlier definitions, actually, including one by the CDC, the U.S. Centers of Disease Control, said that everything that lingers beyond the first 30 days, because they felt like 90 days or 3 months is really too long. And then subsequent definitions by other bodies, including the recently released definition by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, they want to sort of, to prolong that acute phase from the first 30 days to the first 90 days. But going back to your question, in most individuals, when they get COVID, they do just fine. They have respiratory symptoms, or they have symptoms, fever or body aches, et cetera, in the first few days, and then they fully recover. But I think we worry, and especially what long COVID is really these individuals that continue to either have lingering problems, lingering symptoms, for weeks on end that actually may last for months or years, or new emerging symptoms that may emerge later on as a result of the infection, as a result of COVID-19.
How did you get involved in researching long COVID? What led you to this field?
Well, at the very beginning of the pandemic, I run a group of clinical epidemiologists here at the VA St. Louis healthcare system. And at the very beginning of the pandemic, I remember us sort of sitting around a virtual table, actually on Zoom at that time, and then reflecting on, the state of affairs in the country and how can we help. We literally, actually metaphorically, saw the house on fire and saw the country in crisis, saw the world in crisis, and then we sort of said, how can we help? And as a group of clinical epidemiologists, I think that at that time, we didn't even know that long COVID existed. We wanted to use our data and our knowledge of sifting through data and analyzing data to identify key questions that the public really cares about and address them using our data. So initially, we started doing studies, on COVID versus flu, and that was at that time sort of in the national conversation: is COVID worse than the flu? Is COVID milder than the flu? Et cetera, et cetera. Actually, still to this day, that's a question. But our earliest studies were on COVID versus flu, comparing COVID versus flu, and then we started hearing from patients that they're having these lingering problems, that they're having these issues, cough, lingering fatigue, lingering brain fog. And at that time, it didn't even have a name. And then I came across an op-ed piece written in New York Times by Fiona Lowenstein, where she said, well, we need to talk about what coronavirus recoveries look like, because I was young and healthy. I did not have any medical problems. Everybody was telling me that if I got COVID, I will bounce back and, completely recover. But here I am, weeks after the initial illness. I haven't fully recovered, and something is wrong here. What you guys are telling us, what public health officials were telling us at the time, that does not really jive with reality. So that launched us on a story or on a journey or trying to understand, what is Fiona talking about? What's her experience? Why are some people in the country are talking about not recovering fully from COVID-19? And at that time, it didn't even have a name. It didn't have a name of long COVID, but we started sort of listening to those questions by patients and wanting to address them, and one thing led to another, and we found ourselves fully immersed in understanding and studying and understanding long COVID.
Since this began, and maybe we first arrived at the idea, as you point out, that there's something going on here that's not normal for a respiratory illness. How much do we know about long COVID now compared to what we knew then, and how is it still evolving?
So our understanding is really definitely evolving by the day, but I choose to view the glass half full, that 4 years into it, we actually know a lot about the symptomatology of long COVID. We know a lot about the mechanisms of long COVID, why long COVID really happens in some individuals. We know a lot about the clinical features of long COVID. So we've advanced our understanding significantly over the past 4 years, and recently, I just happened to look up sort of the number of papers that have been done or the number of scientific publications that have been done on long COVID in the past 4 years. And we came up with a number like that's available on PubMed in the search engine of more than 36,000 papers that have been published in the span of just 4 years on long COVID. And that's really just so your listeners can grasp what that really means. That's really makes long COVID the most researched, medical condition in any 4 years of medical scientific undertaking. So in the past several hundred years, we've researched a lot of conditions. In the span of 4 years, the last 4 years was so much, intensely focused on understanding long COVID that it became, that we produce as a humanity, as civilization, collectively, all of us throughout the world, produced more than 36,000 papers. Comparatively speaking, there's no other disease, not cancer, not heart disease, that we've studied with this intensity in just 4 years. So we certainly, we've made, significant strides in understanding long COVID. Does that really mean we've solved everything? Absolutely not. But we're more clear-eyed about long COVID now. We have a better, clarity about what the disease is and what it entails than we were, 3 or 4 years ago.
Well, tell me about the latest understanding then. I mean, you're right at the forefront of this research. What are we learning right now about long COVID? And what I guess, would you like listeners who I think by and large, unless they've been affected by it, know long COVID as something that can possibly happen, but probably won't after you get a case of COVID? What are the things that they actually really need to know here?
What they really need to know, your listeners, and thankful again for having me, is that long COVID can affect people across the lifespan. We have literally kids with long COVID. We have a 101-year-old person with long COVID. It can affect people across the lifespan, from children to older adults. It can affect men. It can affect women. It can affect people across race and ethnicity, national background, and sexual orientation. And it could certainly affect people regardless of whether they were previously healthy or have medical conditions. We know that the risk of long COVID generally declined as the pandemic has progressed, primarily as a function of two major drivers. One is vaccination. Vaccines reduce the risk of long COVID. And two, the virus itself has changed on us over the past several years. And the subvariants that are available right now or that are circulating right now seem to result in less risk of long COVID in general than the variants that were circulating very early on in the pandemic. Number three, to your listeners, so going back to what is long COVID, long COVID is really the long-term health effects of the infection, through the long-term impact, the long-term scars that the infection leaves on your body. It can affect nearly every organ system. It's almost hardwired now in the public imagination and public consciousness and public debate that long COVID is fatigue and brain fog. And that's true. Some people experience fatigue and some people experience brain fog, but that's not all it. Some people have heart problems. Some people have kidney problems. Some people have strokes or mini strokes. It can literally affect nearly every organ system in the body. And then we now, over the past several years, we sort of learn how to generally manage it. In some instances, there are lots of long COVID clinics throughout North America, including some in Canada and some in the US and elsewhere in the world. An intense effort is actually being made to try to help us discover curative treatments for long COVID.
Before we get to those treatments, what exactly do we know now about, you've kind of hinted at it a couple times, about the prevalence of long COVID and who gets it? I know anybody can get it, but what are the more indicative risk factors, if we even know that? And when we say some people get it, what are we talking about? 1 in 10, 1 in 30?
Sure. So generally speaking, the risk of long COVID has declined substantially over the course of the pandemic. It was about 10%, 1 out of 10 people in the very early phase of the pandemic among unvaccinated individuals who got the ancestral strain of COVID-19. That's sort of the original strain, or we call it the ancestral strain of COVID-19. The strain that was circulating in North America and much of the world in 2020. That was about 10%. That's 1 out of 10 individuals who got infected then. And remember then, at that time, vaccines were not available. None of us were vaccinated. And that has declined substantially to about a low now. We measured it recently, about 3.5% out of 100 people among adults. So that's really, among vaccinated individuals in the Omicron era. So that's really a significant decline. That means out of 100 people, out of 100 neighbors or 100 people, there are probably 3 to 4 individuals who may be impacted with long COVID out of 100 people that you may know. And that's low and high. So then what do I mean by that? Low 3.5% is definitely single digits, reassuring it's low. But it also from a population health perspective is actually quite high because, all of us got infected with COVID-19 at least once, right? So even a small number multiplied by the, the hundreds of millions of people who got infected with COVID-19 over the, across the globe translates literally into hundreds of millions of cases of long COVID across the globe. So whilst 3.5% is single digit and is reassuringly low, it has to be interpreted within the context of a really, infection rates that are genuinely of pandemic proportions. Before the pandemic, some people used to, hyperbolize or use pandemic proportions as a hyperbole. This is actually a fact now. Like literally, nearly most everybody on Earth got infected with COVID-19. So even a small percentage times really the huge number of people who got infected with COVID-19 translates into substantial burden to countries and societies globally.
And does the chance of getting long COVID, this is something that I've heard, so I will just ask, does it increase the more times that you're infected with COVID? Do we know if any of the strains that are circulating are more conducive to giving you long COVID? Like, how closely can we track that kind of stuff?
Sure, reinfection really matters. Reinfection is consequential. And I know we want to live in a world where reinfection is inconsequential, that getting COVID again and again and again, it doesn't really matter. But we measured it, and actually there is a nice report released by the Statistics Canada suggesting that in our results and in other results, so there's actually evidence from multiple countries, including Canada, including the US, and also the UK, suggesting that reinfection is consequential, meaning that reinfection contributes additional risk. So let me explain it this way to your audience, that 2 infections are worse than 1. Yes, the second one might be milder in some individuals than the first one, but certainly having a second infection or having a third infection is worse than just having, 2 or 1. So reinfection really is consequential and remains consequential. And again, I know sort of the itch to move on and itch to normalize COVID and the itch to sort of put it all behind us. But the fact is that actually most of the people now that come to the long COVID clinic are people who had long COVID after reinfection. The classic story in the clinic right now is that, I got COVID, in 2021 and it did just fine. I had no problems after it in 2021. And then I got COVID now recently in early 2024. And now I'm in a long COVID clinic, right? So the very classic story nowadays is that as a matter of fact, most of the newcomers to the long COVID clinics developed long COVID after reinfection. It's really important for the audience to appreciate this, because I think some in the media like to portray or the people who've had COVID before and who've been vaccinated are as somehow super immune, and some people refer to them as supermen or superwomen, like they're super immune because they've been vaccinated and have had COVID before, so they're shielded from the ill effect of the virus. And that's not true. Immunity wanes with time. Immunity is not permanent. It wanes with time. And people can get reinfection. And we certainly see long COVID after reinfection, both in the data, including data from Canada, from Statistics Canada, from the UK, from the US, and also anecdotally also in the clinics.
That is great context for who's arriving at the clinics and what they're suffering from. In 4 years, what have we done to treat this? How far have we come? And what do we actually treat it with at this point?
So there are a lot of management approaches. I think the beauty about the long COVID, if there is anything, is that it's an infection-associated chronic condition. And generally speaking, this is not a new field. This has been ignored, a new field in science or medicine. This is in infections in some cases cause chronic illnesses. We label all of that as infection-associated chronic illnesses. And when long COVID hit, when we started realizing that we have all these patients with long COVID, we started sort of leaning back on the, evidence and scientific understanding that the community who studied, the community of researchers who studied infection-associated chronic illnesses. And there are a lot of management protocols sort of leaning on that experience sort of helped us manage some of our patients. Now, there's no curative treatment or no new FDA medications that are approved specifically for long COVID. However, don't despair. It doesn't really mean that there's nothing that in the clinic that we can do to help patients. There are a lot of management strategies, a lot of sort of protocols, et cetera, that could be implemented in the clinic depending on the symptom that the patient is experiencing to really help them. So in short, there are management protocols or symptomatic management that we implement in the clinic to help patients manage their symptoms. Currently, there is no curative treatment. The work is underway by a lot of research groups in Canada, in the US, and elsewhere to identify treatments to completely cure long COVID. But those are still in the works.
So you mentioned people show up at your long COVID clinic. I know there is at least one or two in Toronto here where we are. How available are these kind of clinics and is support for people who have come down with this?
So there is not enough clinic anywhere, not in the US, not in Canada, not in the UK, not enough clinic anywhere to deal with the capacity. As we said, like this is really, affects literally hundreds of millions of people around the world. And I don't think that everyone needs to go to a long COVID clinic. I think we need to do a better job educating primary care providers, general practitioners, the larger workforce of healthcare professionals to recognize long COVID and manage most of it. Not all long COVID patients need to go to, a multidisciplinary clinic in a university hospital or a sort of a big center. A lot of patients could actually be treated very, very well and managed very, very well with the primary care physicians if we actually are educating, we train that primary care physician to recognize long COVID and to address the symptoms. And I think this is where we need to focus our effort, because they're not going to be, no matter how we deal with this, they're not going to be a sustainable strategy to sort of build all these centers to address long COVID. I think we need to sort of be more pragmatic about it and really endow the healthcare providers, the primary care physicians, the physician assistants, the general practitioners with the knowledge and confidence to recognize long COVID and treat long COVID.
The last thing I want to ask you, and thank you, first of all, for educating us all and bringing some awareness to this, because, again, it's a concept a lot of people have maybe heard about, but don't know the details of until they or someone they love is hit with it. So thank you for that. The last thing I want to ask, though, is you mentioned an incredibly intense amount of research over 4 years. What do we still not know about long COVID, and what are you trying to find out?
I think most importantly is really the treatment. How do we really cure this long COVID thing? Because for the patients who are suffering, and some of them, we haven't really touched upon this, but I think it's really important to actually touch upon this in the concluding segment. Some forms of long COVID are severely disabling to the point that they really disable people from being able to work. It upends marriages, it upends friendships. In some cases, it could be severely disabling to the point that people are bedbound. For those patients who are bedbound, who are suffering, who really have been significantly and severely impacted by long COVID, they want treatment yesterday and they need treatment yesterday. So I think that's really the where we need to channel most of our energy to really be able to, identify what treatments work. Curative treatments, what curative treatments really work for long COVID, and the treatments that don't work. And the only way to get there is to do more and more trials, to trial either novel drugs or repurposed drugs to try to understand what works and what doesn't. That's really the area that occupies a lot of my thinking and the effort. And this is what I want, our country and countries throughout the world to channel resources in that area. Because for the people who are impacted, we can just sit down and talk about the epidemiology and a lot of really, other aspects of long COVID. What matters to them the most is treatment that is going to improve their quality of life. They are bedbound, they are severely disabled, they can't remember things because of the brain fog, they can't work, they can't really, keep friendships or marriages, and it's really, 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 really hard. And those people need help as soon as possible.
Dr. Al-Aly, thank you so much for the work you're doing on this and for sharing it with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Dr. Ziyad Al-Aly, a clinical epidemiologist at Washington University in St. Louis. That was the big story. For more from us, including previous episodes, many, many, many of them on COVID and long COVID, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. I won't blame you if you don't want to revisit those years. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other by writing to us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling us and leaving a voicemail at 416-935-5935. The Big Story is available in all your favorite podcast players, and it's on your smart speakers. You know by now to just ask them to play the Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.